Well, we've got to be grateful for our comparative freedom from the worst ravages of this pandemic. Only the naive or those who can't read a balance sheet could argue we've escaped unscathed, because we haven't. Not least, there's a long-term hit from the businesses that will never recover, and all the eye-watering extra spending and the massive increase in government control over the past 12 months or so. At the beginning of last year, the notion that state borders could be routinely closed and that whole cities could be ordered into lockdown on the basis of just a handful of cases of an infectious disease would have been dismissed as laughable. That's when we were talking about suppression, of course, and not where we've ended up, with premiers running an eradication strategy because it's worked wonders for them politically. And in the absence of a near universal rollout of vaccines that are generally held to be safe and effective, this sort of border bastardry can be expected to continue, which is why anyone with an eye on the economy is watching the rollout of the vaccines as carefully as perhaps the stock market. Of course, we're right to be buoyed that Australia's death toll has turned out to be far less than anything we're seeing in Italy, Britain and America. And we're right to be encouraged that the latest economic forecast is for growth approaching 5% in the current financial year and approaching 3% thereafter. Still, I doubt that disruptions of this magnitude, even if they turn out to be temporary, won't leave lasting scars. Maybe the 500,000 overseas students that used to be here at any one time will be happy to pay for virtual lectures more or less indefinitely. But if they're not, that's a $40 billion a year industry we won't have anything like to the same extent. Maybe the tourism industry used to sustain up to 1 million jobs in Australia in hospitality and accommodation. Maybe it'll be unaffected by the long-term closure of our international borders and the capricious and unpredictable closure of our domestic borders, because local spending will simply replace spending from abroad and interstate. Maybe the sector will just shrug off the estimated losses due to the collapsed travel of last year. $80 billion down they are. But if it doesn't come back in the way it was, that will mean a permanent shrinkage in our economy. Then there's all the CBD office space that's been empty for a year and that's not likely to be refilled anytime soon, and all the businesses that used to thrive in those so-called inner city hubs of activity. The office jobs might come back, some of the service jobs, sure. But what about all the restaurants and cafes and all the other little businesses? Supermarkets, they've stayed open during the pandemic, but not so the inner city ecosystem of our capitals. And while people on the public sector payroll, well, they've not lost a cent. Indeed, many state public servants and politicians actually got pay increases during the pandemic. Much of the private sector, well, it's been on JobKeeper, and many of them have also, in addition, had a 20% pay cut. What about the tens of thousands of small businesses that will never reopen and whose owners are down hundreds of thousands of dollars? Given 1 in every 2 Australians are employed by small business, that statistic alone shows us that this is an economic hit that should concern us all. But these examples aside, far and away the biggest issue of this pandemic is debt. And it's the one where adverse consequences can't be hidden from. Figures out today from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, show that Australia's pandemic-driven public debt increase has been proportionately greater than of any other advanced economy. Look at the graph. There's Australia. What it shows is that our combined state and federal government debt is expected to rise from just under 50% of GDP to just under 80% of GDP in 3 years. Now, this 30% of GDP increase equates to almost $600 billion of extra debt, all pandemic related, and all of which will eventually have to be repaid. But of course, not a dollar of debt can be repaid until budgets move back into surplus, can they? And that's not now. Surpluses expected for decades. And when we're not in surplus, when we're in deficit and debt, what that means, it's the dead money of interest. That's because people might be surprised to hear this, just like you pay interest on your mortgage, governments pay interest on what they've borrowed, largely what they've borrowed from overseas. Now, politicians, they'll try and spin this interest cost as not much of a problem, given that debt repayment now is currently much the same as it was prior to the COVID pandemic. That's because, of course, of these ultra low interest rates. But the idea that real people will continue indefinitely to lend money with almost no return, well, it's fanciful. Interest rates will eventually rise, and Australians will end up foregoing the things they need then, like schools and better roads and stronger armed forces, because of the spending now. That's why every dollar spent dealing with this pandemic matters as much as it does. To pretend otherwise, you are living in a fool's paradise. All the more important then, isn't it, for the government to get cracking on the things that they can do in a policy sense that will strengthen our economy. Reliable, affordable baseload power, drought-proofing new dams, red tape reductions, all these really important things that have been put aside or put in the too hard basket while COVID has monopolised the attention of our governments around the country. Whenever anyone gets self-congratulatory over our response to the pandemic, please remind them, my Credlin viewers, remind them that we need to remember how much harder everything has now become, weighed down as we are by this debt, and not to underestimate the size of the task we've still got ahead of us.